I'm sure I must have noticed it before, but in reading through Exodus chapter 23, God's just giving instruction after instruction after instruction for how his people are living community together. And almost back to back, he says two things about poor people and their lawsuits. Apparently, when poor people bring lawsuits against people, we have ways we have to treat them. And he says two things. The first one he says is, do not show favoritism toward the poor people in their lawsuit. In other words, just because they're poor, that doesn't necessarily make them right in their lawsuit. You don't have to favor people just because they're poor. But then just a couple of lines later, he says, don't oppress the poor people in their lawsuits. You can't take advantage of people just because they're poor. But you can't show them favoritism just because they're poor. I mean, it's almost like God's just saying, treat them like, well, people, not objects defined by their worth. This is Steve Ridgell, and I think a lot about how God wants us to treat people. And I hear a lot about poor people, and even in the country I live in, the United States, in our culture, there are people that say you ought to, just because people are poor, you ought to give them advantages and privileges and help them and take from the rich and give to them. And then there are also people that, well, one reason we have poor people is because some people oppress the poor. They take advantage of them. They brutalize them economically. They keep them poor. You know, it's funny, Jesus never does seem so concerned, and God doesn't seem so concerned either about making everyone equal financially. They do seem very concerned about treating people the way God treats people, loving our neighbors ourselves. Don't have to give somebody favoritism, but don't ever oppress anybody. Treat people like people made in God's image. This is Steve Ridgell, resolving to do a better job of not looking at the circumstances, but looking at the people.